Hello, this is Nathan Faust from Faithwise Defenders. If you like this YouTube channel, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Also, consider sharing this video with your friends and family members. After all, we're all about spreading God's Word. Justice delayed is not justice denied. William E. Gladstone. In a world often marred by corruption, lies, and false accusations, it can be tempting to lose hope in the possibility of justice. Yet Psalm 7 invites us into a posture of unwavering faith that God is always at work in ways we may not immediately understand. David's prayer in this psalm is both a cry for deliverance and a declaration of God's righteousness. It's a song of trust in the Lord who sees all, knows all, and will ultimately make all things right. David opens with a heartfelt plea for God's protection as he finds himself under attack by enemies who seem bent on his destruction. O Lord my God, in you I take refuge. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. Psalm 7, verse 1. His distress is palpable, and we can almost hear the urgency in his voice. He calls upon God to rescue him from the lion, an image of fierce, relentless pursuit. In our own lives, there are moments when the weight of injustice, slander, or misunderstanding presses in on us. We may not face literal lions, but we know the crushing force of accusations or attacks that seek to tear us apart. What is our response in those moments? Psalm 7 offers a model. Take refuge in God. David's first instinct is not to defend himself, but to run to the Lord, trusting that God alone can provide true deliverance. His prayer reminds us that ultimately God is our refuge, not our arguments, not our own efforts at self-justification, but the living God who shields us. David's plea for deliverance is not just about his personal suffering, but about the justice of God. In verses 3 through verse number 5, he boldly declares his innocence. O Lord, if I have done this, if I have repaid my ally with evil or without cause, have robbed my foe, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Psalm 7, verse number 3 through verse number 5. David invites God to examine his heart and actions, confident that God will reveal the truth. David's posture here is one of trust in God's righteous judgment. He doesn't merely ask for deliverance from his enemies. He asks for God to weigh his heart and actions. This is a bold act of transparency before God. It is as if David says, God, if I have sinned, show me and deal with me justly. If I am innocent, vindicate me. This is not a plea for a quick escape from suffering, but for God's perfect justice. How often do we find ourselves fighting to prove our own innocence, wanting to convince others of our right standing? Yet David's example calls us to trust in God's examination of our hearts. He sees beyond the surface to the very motives of our actions. Our responsibility is not to defend ourselves in the face of false accusations, but to trust that God will expose the truth. Here's the key phrase: in His perfect time. As David continues, he turns his attention to the enemies who seek his destruction. He invokes God's anger against evil, not as a personal vendetta, but as a plea for the eradication of unrighteousness. Psalm 7, verse number 6 says, "Lord, in your anger, rise up against the rage of my enemies." David's prayer is a reminder that God's wrath is not arbitrary. It is a righteous response to sin and injustice. We may struggle with the idea of God's anger, especially in light of Jesus' command to love our enemies. But we must understand that God's anger is always just. It is not driven by personal offense, but by His holy hatred of sin and His love for justice. When we face injustice, we may not immediately see the hand of God moving, but Psalm 7 teaches us that God is at work, righteously responding to evil. God's anger, as described in the psalm, is not arbitrary wrath, but a response to a deliberate actions of those who make trouble and devise wickedness. Psalm 7, verse 14 through 16. It's a reminder that God will not allow evil to go unpunished forever. His judgment is coming, and we can trust that He will bring justice to those who perpetrate evil. The psalm concludes with a very powerful statement of assurance that God is a righteous judge. Psalm 7, verse number 11. David declares that God's justice is sure, even when we cannot see it in the moment. The wicked may prosper for a time, but God's righteousness will prevail. David, fully confident in God's judgment, commits to giving thanks and praise to the Lord for His righteous actions. I will give thanks to the Lord because of His righteousness. Psalm 7, verse number 17. This closing declaration is a response to the surety of God's justice. Even before the resolution of his distress, David praises God for the justice that is coming. This is the appropriate response when we are wronged: to worship. We do not need to take matters into our own hands, to seek revenge, or to wallow in our bitterness. Instead, we can rest assured that God will make things right. And in that certainty, we can worship Him. Psalm 7 calls us to live in the tension between present suffering and future justice. The world may be full of injustice, but God is not indifferent. He sees, He knows, and He will act. And while we wait for His righteous judgment, we are called to trust Him, to surrender our pain to Him, and to worship Him in the confidence that He is good, He is just, and He will bring about His justice in His perfect time. When injustice seems to reign and we find ourselves wrongly accused or attacked, Psalm 7 reminds us that God is our refuge, our righteous judge, and our defender. We are called to trust in His justice, knowing that He will ultimately right every wrong. And in the meantime, we respond with faith, worship, and gratitude, even in the face of adversity. As we reflect on this psalm, let us rest in the truth that God's justice is not delayed. It is simply unfolding according to His perfect will. We do not need to fear or become weary. Our God will act. And when He does, His justice will be perfect. His ways will be right, and we will know that He alone is worthy of our trust and our praise. In the words of King David, I will give thanks to the Lord because of His righteousness. Psalm 7:17. Let this be our prayer today and always.